about vaccines this morning. You've been hearing a lot about them over the past 6 months or so, where they're being created, who's going to get them, the funding behind them. It's fair to say the world has actually been put on pause, sort of waiting for these jabs. So what actually is a vaccine? How do they work? Who better to break it down than Dr. Mike and Dr. Matt? They have their own medical podcast. They're also senior lecturers and researchers from Griffith University and your resident doctors here on ABC Newcastle and New South Wales. Mornings, Dr. Matt, Dr. Mike. Good morning.
Morning. How are you?
Morning.
Good. Hey, Matt, let's start with you. How are vaccines created? How does it all work?
All right, so before answering this question, I think we just need to get a hold of the concept of what immunity is. So when our bodies get invaded by a microbe, let's say a virus or a bacteria, our immune system will realise that this microbe is foreign. So it's got a uniform that it wears which is different to our own cells, and we call this an antigen. Now, our first response to this microbe is what we call the innate immune response. And what it does is produce something called inflammation, which I'm sure you've heard before. Now, what that will do is it will increase blood flow at that area of the infection to bring help to that area. It will also seal off that area from the rest of the body, but it will also tell the rest of the body that there's something happening which is bad or untoward. Now, the way that it does this is through chemical signaling or chemical communication. So our cells don't have telephones. They have to send signals by chemicals. Now, one of these chemicals is what we call cytokines, and cytokines just flush through your body, and they can cause other kind of side effects like fevers and muscle pain and fatigue. Now, those cytokines tell the other part of the immune system, which we call the second response, to bring in the real specialized heavy hitters, and we call these the Bs and T cells. Now, when they come to the area of the infection or where the microbe is, they can very precisely find that uniform of the microbe, and then they start to produce antibodies against it. Now, these antibodies will not only kill the microbe, but they will remember it for next time. So if you encounter that microbe, in 3 years' time, you've got memory and you know how to kill it quickly. Now, that whole process that we just went through, that will take some toll on the body. It's a bit taxing. And so if you're older or if you're sick, that can actually potentially kill you. So what medicine has done is come up with an alternative to achieve that immunity, and we use vaccines. So vaccines will still get the end product, which is immunity, but you don't have to get sick to achieve that. Now, the main types of vaccine, which you asked for, one of the first ones we invented was what we call the live attenuated vaccine. So what this means is the virus is still alive, but it's so weak it won't cause any disease to you. An example of this one is measles, the measles vaccine. Another type of vaccine we can use is actually kill the virus. So we just kill it completely and then we throw it in through a vaccine and we recognize it, we build immunity. An example of this is polio. Another one is the subunit vaccine, and this is where we just kind of grab the uniform off the microbe or the antigen and just throw that in. And again, we can produce immunity that way without getting sick. Hepatitis B is a good example for that type of vaccine. And then finally, we have the toxoid vaccines. So this is not so much against the microbe, this is against the products or the toxins that it produces, like, for instance, tetanus. So that's a vaccine against tetanus. Now, when we go to the COVID one, which Mike will explain, I guess, now, these are very new type of vaccines which we haven't really used before. So Mike will give you the specifics there.
Yeah, Mike, let's talk about that, because that's sort of why we are focusing on this big V word, is because, we're all sort of waiting and we're seeing the rollout of this new vaccine in certain parts of the world. It's expected to happen here a little later this month. How is the COVID-19 vaccine a little bit different to what we've seen historically?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different COVID vaccines that are up and about. So probably two that you're hearing in the UK and the US, for example, would be the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And they work through a method unlike any of the ways that Matt has spoken about. So it's a new method. It's called using mRNA. So basically the concept you need to get is that within every cell of your body, except your red blood cells, you have the genetic material called DNA, which ultimately your body wants to read and turn into proteins. And proteins do all the structural roles and functional roles in your body. So they're extremely important. So DNA needs to turn to that protein, but DNA is poorly read. It's a hard copy. We need a more easier way to read DNA. So what the body does is it takes your DNA, turns it into mRNA, which is more readable, and then that mRNA can turn into proteins. Now, the thing is, when you get invaded by microbes or viruses or whatever it may be, they tend to have a lot of proteins on their surface. And the body is very smart at being able to recognize proteins and knowing whether they belong to us or they don't.
Yep.
So for example, the COVID or SARS-CoV-2 virus, if you've seen pictures of it, it's sort of like this envelope with a little bit of DNA type of stuff inside called RNA, but it's surrounded by proteins called spike proteins, also known as S proteins. Now, the body recognizes that as not belonging to us. Now, interestingly, what these researchers have done is they've taken the spike protein, they've figured out what the DNA sequence is to make it, and therefore figured out what the mRNA is to make it, and they inject the mRNA into our body, stick it in some fat, because fat loves cells. All of our cells of our body are made up of fat.
I'm feeling attacked after the summer months, but anyway, carry on.
All of us, all of our cells are made out of fat. And so they put that mRNA into this thing of fat, they inject it into us, it goes into our cells, it doesn't get incorporated into our DNA, it doesn't what we call intercalate in our DNA, it just sits there and gets read and gets turned into the S protein or that spike protein. And therefore the body goes, wait a minute, this doesn't belong to us. It then takes that spike protein and presents it to those immune cells that Matt said, the T and B cells. And then we've developed an immunity to it. So that's how the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine work. The AstraZeneca vaccine is a little bit different. It simply just uses the DNA sequence. So instead of mRNA, it just uses the DNA. And the only difference is DNA is a little bit hardier. But basically that DNA will then, in our body, turn to mRNA, which will then be read as the spike protein. And again, we'll develop an immunity to the spike protein. So that if we ever get invaded by SARS-CoV-2, we've seen it before, we don't get sick.
Yeah. Matt, I don't think we can talk about vaccines without talking about safety and some of the concerns that we see around this as well. How seriously is safety taken around vaccines, and should we have any worries as the COVID vaccine is starting to be rolled out?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I'll start off with safety. So I was reading this morning, according to the FDA in America, they put out a briefing which was the summary of the clinical trials from the mRNA vaccines. So that was the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines. So in terms of the adverse reactions that people exhibited after getting either one or both doses, the most common adverse effect that they found was pain at the injection site. So of those people who had any kind of adverse effects, about 91% had pain at the injection site. Other common adverse effects were fatigue, muscle pain, joint pain, fever or chills. Now, all those things is a typical innate response, as we spoke about earlier. So anytime you turn on your immune system, all those things is very common. So I think rather than look at adverse effects, we should actually look at that and say they're actually a normal process of the immune system. So similarly for you, if you were to go to the gym and do a really, really hard workout, 2 days later, you would be sore.
2 days? I'm feeling the kettlebell swings from yesterday, mate.
Well, that's telling you that your body has had a challenge and it's responding to it, which is actually a good response, and you want to get that to get an outcome. And same with our immune system. Some of the adverse effects that I just listed are all good effects that tells you that the immune system is working. Now, in terms of serious adverse effects, there was actually no difference between that with the placebo. So that was where they just injected salty water into the person instead of the actual mRNA. So that's a good thing. So in terms of the safety outcomes, it's a really good sign. Now, in terms of... Sorry.
I was going to say, it's been a pretty quick turnaround, though. Do you think that sometimes that concerns people?
I think it does concern people, but I think we need to reassure everyone that all the normal stringent requirements that go into any clinical trial remains the same. The only thing that really occurs differently is the time between each trial is very quick. So normally if you were going between each phase of the clinical trial, you'd have to spend years not only reporting the results, because usually you only have a small team to analyse all the results, write up the results and then publish it, but also you have to then apply for funding, which can take many years. So the difference here is all these research labs are given like an open check and they just said, get it done quickly, and so we can just progress really fast. But there's no...
So I was just going to say, it actually shows what science can do if it's well-funded and well-resourced. Science can actually do great science really quickly. So instead of thinking about it as though, oh, it's too quick, it's actually, this is what science can do.
Yeah. And how far we've come, perhaps, from when those first vaccines, were first created.
That's right.
Absolutely.
That's right.
All right, Mike, let's finish. We've got about 3 minutes to the news, a quick fire myth busting on vaccines. Why do vaccines have ingredients that sound scary like mercury and aluminium in them?
Okay, first of all, mercury. We haven't had a vaccine in Australia that's had mercury in it for about 20 years. And even when it did, there's two types of mercury, methyl and ethyl, like Matt's auntie's names. Ethyl is excreted within 7 days. That's the one in a vaccine. So we excrete it. Methyl's the one that you can find in fish. That's the one that does accumulate. So don't worry about that. The aluminium, it's aluminium salts. I know it sounds scary with aluminium because we use aluminium foil, for example, but aluminium salts are different. It's used as an adjuvant. It means you need less of the actual vaccine for it to have its effect. So it sort of supports it. But we get aluminium salts in all the foods, all the drinks that we eat. So, for example, a breastfed baby in its first 6 months of life will get about 10 milligrams of aluminium salts. If it's formula fed in that first 6 months, it gets 120 milligrams. Now, every vaccine in the first 12 months of a baby is only 4.2 milligrams.
Is it dangerous for children to have so many vaccines at a young age?
No, because you've got to think about the immunological components. So the parts of the vaccines which the body recognises to create immunity against. Now, babies, they put things in their mouth. They're exposed to soil and bacteria and all this stuff. There's thousands upon thousands of immunological components in all the things that they put in their mouth. But there's very few associated with vaccines because we've minimised it. So no, there's not a problem with getting so many vaccines at once.
All right, and in 45 seconds, what is the link between vaccines and autism?
Okay, in 2 seconds, there is none.
Excellent, and we're done. It's going to be really interesting to see how it all works. We've been watching the world as vaccines have rolled out in Europe and in America. It is our turn very, very soon. Dr. Matt, Dr. Mike, thank you for taking us into this world today.
Thanks for having us.
Dr. Matt and Dr. Mike.